Intro chat with Merill's live, digging deep where techs thrive. From the latest hacks to cool updates, join the ride, don't be late.
Hey folks, welcome to another episode of Intro Chat. Today I have one of my ex-colleagues, but he's now working as a principal domain architect.
Yep.
Did I get that right? At
Yep.
Increment. And Mark, he comes up with all these fascinating questions for me over the last few months, and I was really intrigued about what he was working on and what he has built. And it's a lot to do with a topic that all of us Entra admins think about around securing Entra, knowing what's happening in your tenant. And I know, Mark, you found some really interesting things. So, Mark, do you want to just give us a quick intro about yourself, what you do?
Yeah, sure. So as Merill mentioned, he and I were formerly colleagues at Microsoft. So previously I'd spent 20 years at Microsoft in various roles, phone support, field engineering, mission critical, and then product group in the same team as Merill. And then following that, I've landed at Increment. So we're a pure play Microsoft partner. I'm a principal domain architect for identity at Increment. So we're out there helping customers adopt the Microsoft stack. Obviously my focus is identity.
Nice. Awesome. Yeah. Cool. So tell us about this concept that you're building. Like, tell us the need for what it is that you're trying to achieve, and then we'll dig, deep dive into all the things you found out and what learnings people can take away from that.
Yeah, sure. So it was fairly on in my time at Increment that we had a customer asking about PAM, how they could achieve PAM. And it was something that I'd been thinking about for a little while in terms of whether it could be something you could deliver with the Microsoft stack, like just every component being Microsoft. And I think at the time there'd been a few product developments that had led me to think it was more achievable. So things like group writeback.
Right. Before we get into that, just for those who may be like very new to identity, and what's PAM, like the terminology, like privileged access management. So what does that mean?
Sure, it can mean a few different things depending on the vendor who's providing the solution. But typically people think about just-in-time elevation into privileged roles or groups. So in Entra, obviously, we've got PIM, and that allows just-in-time elevation into admin roles. And historically on-prem, so Microsoft had what they would refer to as Bastion Forest, and they would use Microsoft Identity Manager to facilitate the just-in-time elevation part.
So that obviously you don't have like continuous access as an admin onto your domain, right? Like in on-prem AD, you have this concept of not even having a domain admin, and you just create the account when you need it and you sign into it. Like that's
it's not sort of account creation just in time. The account is there. The mechanism that the traditional MIM PAM would use is you would have a separate forest and domain where the accounts would reside. And then through some special features that were introduced in Windows Server 2016, you would have a trust from production into that red forest, as they kind of refer to it. And then MIM would perform a just-in-time elevation activity in the Bastion Forest, and that would allow you to then administer production.
And again, taking a step back, what's a forest for those who don't know?
So a forest for on-premises Active Directory, it's commonly thought of as the security boundary for an organization. So within a forest, you can have multiple domains. Those domains could be resource domains, they could be user domains, and a domain's really a collection of resources that sort of fulfill the same business purpose. So you would have users, their devices, potentially the apps they use residing in a domain. Forest is a collection of domains, and the forest is the security boundary. Yep. Yep.
So the idea we used to have on-prem is that you would have two forests, right? You would try to make sure you secure one forest, like completely lock it down. The users in that forest are the people who would have domain admin access into the other.
In production. Yeah, yeah, that's right. Yeah. So yeah, under PAM, there's also a few other solutions that different vendors have. So one would be password vaulting. So you have to perform some kind of action to the system, and then it'll randomly update the user password and then issue that to you for a period of time so that you can perform the admin task.
That's how I know, like Cybark and others are very popular with that, where the user themselves don't know the password for an account, and they go and ask for a password whenever they need to do something with elevated access, and it just creates a random password and gives it to them, and they can use it. And then when the session is over, the password is again scrambled, so no one knows what the password is for the password to be even leaked.
Yeah, that's right. And another feature that's pretty common is session recording, or that's more common these days. So yeah, they're the sorts of things that can fall under a PAM solution. I don't think, to my knowledge, that the MIM PAM solution ever did session recording. But yeah, so the thinking was, could we deliver the same sort of functionality without using MIM? Because we know that sort of the MIM timeline is limited, and it's also costly and complex to deploy. We wanted something simple, relatively cheap to run, running on only the Microsoft stack. And so I started to think about how could we approach that.
Right. The step back is to like this. How do you bring that to the cloud world? So you have Entra ID, you have an Entra tenant, and you have an on-prem AD that's syncing, and all of that's happening. And you want to bring the idea of that whole red forest concept, where you have another Entra tenant and on-prem AD which is completely locked down.
Yes.
No one has access to it.
Yes.
Maybe it's like, it's very secure. No, very limited users, everyday users never even see it or know about it. And then you have those identities being able to manage the production.
That's right.
Tenant, the other tenant.
Not the production tenant. Well, I mean, we could utilize it for managing the production tenant, but the focus for this when I was developing it was securing the on-prem AD.
The on-prem AD.
Because really, Microsoft's really always pushing, the next thing, right? Like, get to cloud, utilize cloud, AI, all of those sort of modern things. I think what certainly I've found as I've been working for Increment is a lot of customers are still in on-prem, or they have massive footprints on-prem, right? Yeah. And so the thinking was, well, how can we protect the on-prem assets as best as possible? So yeah, that was the thinking. Try and utilize features within Entra to empower the on-premises security.
Okay,
was where I was coming from. Right. So yeah, around the time I was looking at this, Entra was putting a lot of features together that kind of all lined up to make this possible. So things like group writeback, PIM for groups, so just-in-time elevation into groups. I think Entra Private Access had just landed around that time as well. RDP using cloud credentials was another kind of key component. And then, of course, sort of bringing that all together with Phish-resistant credentials and conditional access and that kind of stuff. Yeah. So I can kind of describe how all of that stuff stacks together if you want me to go down that path. Okay, so the first thing was to look at how did MIM Bastion Forest work. And in Server 2016, there were some product enhancements in the server operating system that gave MIM its power to do the just-in-time elevation. So there's a special kind of trust that was allowed called a PAM trust. And that PAM trust enabled the creation of these special objects called shadow principles. So in the Bastion Forest, or the secured forest, these shadow principles can represent security principles in the production domain. So you can kind of like set them up so this shadow principle represents domain admins, or this shadow principle represents schema admins, or whichever groups you want to line that up with. And so the trick was, how do I utilize the shadow principles? And the piece that came together with that was group writeback and PIM for groups. So I could create a group in the Entra tenant, and I could enable that with PIM, so your membership is only active when you've gone through PIM. And then group writeback can sync that back down to on-prem, and that group can sit under the shadow principle. Right. And so in that way, we get this just-in-time elevation through to domain admins or schema admins or whatever it is in on-prem, right? So so that was the first bit, but there's a lot more that needed to be layered in to really provide a cool solution. The first thing that I really had to think about was, if I'm going to have a tenant that sits on top of this and protects the on-prem infrastructure, the tenant has to be secure. And I think we were in a session a while ago where I gave the feedback of, I'd really like to see tenants secure by default, right? Like out of the box, everything's locked down. I think historically, Microsoft's approach has been more about collaboration, so things have been a bit more wide open. But the challenge was going through every policy, every setting in a tenant to go, all right, how do I lock this down? So,
and this is a special tenant, right? Like you don't
right.
have workplace. You're not
Right.
going to be using any of the workplace capabilities that Entra usually comes with for like M365 and
right,
teams
100%.
and guests and all. Like you're not going to have any of those attached.
100%. So the approach was, there's no guests allowed. There's no consent allowed. There's just no applications. There's no subscriptions. Well, except for a subscription to host VMs for the solution, but no M365, all of that sort of thing. So we had to really look at locking the tenant down, and to do that, obviously every admin has to be Phish-resistant. The other thing that I looked at was the use of a privileged access workstation. So Microsoft has guidance around deploying a POR. I think when I was looking at it, I'm not sure if it's been updated, but when I was looking at it, some of the guidance was a bit old, and it was sort of using the Azure AD PowerShell commandlets instead of the newer ones. So some of the scripts and things that sort of automate the creation of a POR had to be adjusted to make it work. and then I kind of had to review the policies that were being pushed to it. So, again, Intune is part of this solution as well, because Intune has to manage the POR. So I had the POR being built by autopilot. You turn it on, it builds, it's secure straight up. I did choose to use physical devices for the PORs
Right.
instead of a cloud POR.
Yeah. So these are
Um,
physical laptop.
Physical laptops, yeah. And again, like, we're talking about administering the tenant, and for that, we only need a small handful of users. So it's not a big cost to the customer. So building a POR, the POR then gives you administrative access to the tenant through Hello for Business. Obviously, everything's locked down really tight with conditional access. So you can only administer the tenant from a POR, and any other device is disallowed. So yeah, we got the tenant nice and tight, and then the next step.
Just a quick
So yeah.
on that. So were the pod devices intra joined, or were they hybrid
Yes,
joined?
intra joined.
They're cloud. Okay.
Yep. So yeah, the first thing before I even thought about on-prem was get the tenant tight, get the access to the tenant really tight, and then from there progress to building out the Bastion Forest. So what we chose to do there was build the Bastion Forest on Azure VMs, and the reason for that is that then the Azure VMs are sitting in a subscription that's tied to the tenant, and the tenant's really tight, so the subscription's really tight as well. And then, through Azure Virtual Networks, we would wire that into the customer's environment. Depending on what they have, we would choose an appropriate way to connect the two at the network layer. So then we build up the Active Directory that's going to act as the Bastion Forest, and again, using all of Microsoft's latest security guidance for AD, we would build that out. And then what I chose to do, and this is a little bit controversial, I think, but the admin accounts for that Active Directory are actually hybrid. And the reason that they're hybrid is that I can then enforce a Phish-resistant credential for them. Right? So by syncing them, I can say, okay, they get a Phish-resistant credential. I can then, on-prem, use smart card required for interactive logon for those admin accounts.
Right.
And then they cannot log in with a username and password. They have to use the Phish-resistant credential. But then the problem becomes, how do you access those servers? Now, domain controllers are a bit of a problem because you can't make them hybrid. So the way we looked at it was, you would only log into the domain controllers with the built-in RID 500 admin account in a break glass scenario. So that RID 500 account, we generate a super long, complex password for it, and it's printed on paper and stuck in a secure location. And if it's ever used, we rotate the password. We create other accounts as the alternate admins, and we deploy an admin box that's a member server in the domain with the AD admin tools on it.
Yeah.
And we make that box hybrid.
Right.
So by making that box hybrid, it'll then accept the Phish-resistant credentials. Yeah. And then the access from the POR to that box is through Entra Private Access.
Okay.
So these VMs are never exposed to the internet. They're just contained in the VNet. And the only way to get to them is through Entra Private Access. And Entra Private Access has a CA policy on it that says you have to come from the POR and you have to use Phish-resistant credentials. And then the RDP piece is to use cloud credential. So you can authenticate from the POR
device, right,
to the admin server, with RDP using Phish-Resistant creds.
And the RDP is also covered by the conditional access
Correct.
policy, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Right. And if it's Windows, I mean, you had to have it in Azure anyway, because if you had it on-prem, you couldn't enforce a conditional access policy, right, for the RDP scenario.
I don't know about.
Because you're using the Azure VM login.
No. I'm using a domain login.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because the user account is hybrid. And so it can log in wherever that box lives. But we just chose to use Azure because the hosting platform is secure. Whereas, say you were hosting it on-prem on, VMware or something, any admin of VMware can take a copy of the VM. So not as secure as if it's all tightly bound inside Azure.
Then it's all just in Azure. You only need to manage the Azure roles that
Right.
people have access on Azure and Entra.
Right. And so the philosophy there is like super tight, small number of admins who can admin the tenant and the Bastion Forest. Right. Okay, so that gets us a really tight tenant. That gets us a really tight Active Directory. We also deployed Defender for Identity in those VMs and set alerts on the RID 500 accounts and anything else that the customer might want an alert on. Alerts on the accounts in the cloud as well. Obviously, Defender for Endpoint on the POR. So we're making full use of the Defender suite there as well. So that gets us all nicely, tightly secure on all of those components. The other thing I would add here, so doing it through Entra Private Access means you don't get session recording. Azure Bastion offers a method for getting session recording, but you can only do session recording if you're connected through the browser. And if you're connected through the browser, you can use Phish-Resistant creds up to the browser session, but from the browser session to the VM, it has to be username and password. So we can do either pattern. If a customer wants session recording, we can't do Phish-Resistant to the endpoint, or vice versa. Now, with Azure Bastion, you can do RDP as well. So we could take Entra Private Access out and use Azure Bastion as the path in with the RDP client. And you can use cloud credentials in that case, but you can't session record if you're using the RDP thick client at the moment. That might change in the future. And if it does, then we get everything, right? But for now, it's kind of one or the other. Right, so that gets us to the point where we've built the whole thing. So we've got Intune doing the POR, we've got everything locked down, we've got the Bastion Forest built, everything's really tight in terms of access there. Obviously, we've deployed Sync to take care of group writeback and the hybrid. So in this solution at the moment, we need both Entra ID Connect for the hybrid join part for the member servers, and we need Cloud Sync for the group writeback. I do know that in the future, Cloud Sync is going to support hybrid join, so we can take Connect out and just use Cloud Sync purely. So I don't think that's too far away if my understanding's right. So yeah, the next bit is just basically to set up the PAM trust between production and the Bastion Forest. And then we can create accounts in the Bastion Forest. Again, and they will be for administration of production. Again, we can set these accounts up to use Phish-Resistant creds, whether that's a FIDO key or if it's another POR specifically for those accounts. Depends on the customer, what the customer wants as a access pattern. And then we use the PIM for groups to drop them in the group.
Nice.
Cloud Sync syncs back on-prem within 2 minutes.
Yep.
Then you're added to the shadow principal and you become a domain admin in production.
Nice.
And at that point, the only consideration there is they have to log on to a member server that resides in the Bastion Forest in order to use the Phish-Resistant credential. So again, we would have, pardon me, would have a jump box or an admin server sitting in the Bastion Forest that allows those users to sign in. And we have the admin tools on there, and then they can admin production. So, we can obviously pretty easily do your tier 0 admins that are just administering AD that way. We can also do this for any admin role really in production. But the trick is if you want Phish-resistant creds for them, they have to be on a member server that resides in the Bastion Forest. And so you need to be able to install admin tools on a box in the Bastion Forest that can access production. If you have the requirement for logging in on the console of a box in production, you can't use Phish-resistant creds in that case. But that becomes kind of not a tier 0 account problem. It's more like a tier 1 account problem where it's maybe SQL servers or web servers or what have you. And you still get the benefit of just-in-time elevation. It's just you can't use the Phish-resistant cred if you have to sign onto the console of that box. So that's a kind of a point-in-time design decision that you have to work through with the customer.
But it won't be the tier 0 accounts, right? Like that's
Correct.
all secured because you have all of them behind that Azure subscription.
Yep,
Right.
absolutely. Yeah, so
So for those who don't know, like when we say tier 0, tier 1,
yeah.
Can you explain that principle of what tier 0, tier 1 means?
Yeah, so Microsoft has kind of, they talk about in slightly different terms these days. They used to have this tiered administration model that they would talk about. Tier 0 being basically domain forest schema admins, anybody who could administer the domain or had ownership over the domain itself. And then tier 1 admins would be administrators of services that reside within the AD. So SQL admins, web server admins, file server admins would all be tier 1 accounts. And then tier 2 is kind of like users, put in simple terms. Microsoft's kind of said that model is outdated now, and the more recent guidance sort of includes infrastructure beyond Active Directory, and it also talks to things like implementing just-in-time controls and implementing strong credentials and those kinds of things. That guidance is a little bit grey in terms of like specifically how do you achieve this stuff. I think what we're doing with this solution actually addresses a lot of those things because we get Phish-resistant, we get just-in-time. But I think they were maybe a little bit non-specific in the docs because they don't have an off-the-shelf product for some of those requirements, right? And you might have to go to the market for a solution. But I do think what Increment's built around this satisfies a lot of those requirements, and the way we've tried to build it as well. So we've done a lot of infrastructure as code around this as well, and automation of a lot of the policy config in the tenant. Like everything we can automate, we kind of have automated. So it's kind of quite quick and repeatable. Obviously there are things where you get in the discussion with the customer and they say, well, maybe we want this or we want that. We can kind of tailor that to their specific needs. But yeah, in general, we've got something quite repeatable, quite robust.
Right. Nice.
Yeah.
Okay. I know when we had some chats before, and I think it was when you were trying to secure the tenant, you uncovered a lot of things, right? Some really fun things, especially with the GDAP. I think the GDAP was one of those.
Yeah.
And so on.
Yeah. So I'll talk about that a little bit. So if you get your tenant from a Microsoft service provider, an MSP, or a cloud solution provider, CSP, um, by default, they have admin control over your tenant and subscriptions. It's kind of like, if you're a larger enterprise or you just go and stand up your own environment, you're not going to have this relationship.
Yeah.
But when you have this CSP relationship, what they tend to do is have, um, you know, global admin control over your tenant. And if you want to stand up a subscription, they have ownership of the subscription.
Because their role model is they provide sort of like IT services to like all these companies, right? And
Right.
a lot of organizations don't have a dedicated IT team or even that knowledge and experience, so they would just rely on a CSP or an MSP, unlike the enterprise world where they have all of that, and they have complete control over the tenant that they.
Yeah, exactly. So what I found was when I initially set up the tenant, and I kind of wasn't really paying attention to the fact that this relationship was in the background. So I set up the tenant, and I got my conditional access policies in place that said Phish-Resistant only. And then we needed a subscription to deploy the VMs.
Right.
And we raised the request, and they couldn't add the subscription. And they're going, "Oh, your conditional access policies are blocking it. Can you configure an exception for us?" And I said, "Hang on a minute.
Yeah, how did you?
I don't want to give you an exception, right?"
Yeah.
So there was a lot of back and forth trying to resolve that. And then when they created the subscription, I only had contributor access. I didn't have ownership. Now that's appropriate, as you say, for some organizations where they want to outsource some of that administrative overhead. And through the Lighthouse interface, you can set up the relationship and say, this is what the CSP is allowed to do. But the other thing that I observed was they'd actually, and I assume this is because they have some automation on their side,
Yeah.
but they'd actually deployed a service principal into the tenant with directory read write all. And again, that for me, like if I'm building a secure solution, that's a bit of a red flag, right? I don't want that in the tenant. For the purposes of me labbing it up, it wasn't a big deal because it's just my lab.
Yeah.
But in the customer case, we had to really make sure that that sort of relationship was broken out of the tenant and the subscription.
Because you locked it down, you don't want anyone else having access to it.
Exactly. So I know you hooked me up with a few people in Microsoft, and I kind of gave the feedback that I think there needs to be some stronger
The default
guidance around that, right? And again, like it makes perfect sense if the CSP is running the IT for the organization, but if you want to control everything yourself, you got to make sure that that's not there.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense from the CSP side. Like they might be managing 50, 100, some
Right.
thousands of tenants, and they need to improve the security of everything. They're not just going to be logging into each one. There, I know there are solutions like SIP and others that give these admin tools to like go across tenants and apply CA policies and lock them down and so on. So that's what a lot of the MSPs and the CSPs use.
Yeah, I think if you were going to deploy a solution like this and you had that relationship in place, you want to really investigate like what's your security look like. If I'm allowing you to come into my tenant, I want to make sure that you're at least as secure as me, right? I don't want to compromise on that. So I think that's a conversation you just have to have if that's how it's set up.
So I do have a question around the group writeback and PIM and the timing. Like, how does the timing work when, for example, you add someone to do the PIM elevation? There is a sort of a delay for that user to be added on-prem. And when does it go off as soon as the PIM elevation is gone? How is that experience?
Really quick, because Cloud Sync has got a 2-minute SLA for syncing changes. And my observation is it's usually at least that quick. It's normally quite a bit shorter. In this environment too, like we're talking about something very small, right? So
The tenant itself is really small, right? There's less
yeah,
overhead on the
yeah.
tenant.
There's really like in the first case where we deployed this, it was 6 admin accounts, I think, in the whole tenant, no apps, and an Azure subscription. And then on-prem, like we're only really building 2 domain controllers so we've got redundancy. It's only 2 because we want redundancy. We could get away with 1, right?
Yeah.
But just 2, and they're in the same site, so replication's really quick. Like it's within 15 seconds. So I would go in, I would elevate into PIM, and you would see that change show up. You know, I guess when it's a 2-minute SLA on average, it would be within a minute. And then you're in and you're doing your admin task. And again, when PIM drops you out of the group, that also updates pretty quickly.
Right. Cool. Okay. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean that experience. It's good to know that you're able to do all of that and have it workable, because I think that's sort of an unknown for a lot of people who might not have tried or might not even be aware that something like that's possible.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember when I was at Microsoft, there was some conversations around, could we just use PIM with group writeback to drop somebody into the domain admins group, like directly, rather than having this Bastion Forest? There's a couple of reasons you can't. One is that group writeback only writes back universal groups. So you can't modify any of the built-in admin groups, and you can't nest that group under any of the built-in admin groups because it's a universal group. So you can't do that. The second concern is all of the replication time. So if you've got a large production network that's dispersed geographically, that group update might take hours to replicate through your whole environment. But with this Bastion, because we've just got 2 DCs right next to each other, it's instant. Yeah.
And they're all in Azure as well. So it goes through the backbone.
Right.
Through the Azure backbone.
Right. Yeah. So it's all really quick. Yeah.
Tell me about the device, right? So you said the power are physical devices, so you're not relying on VMs, which is good, which is something that Microsoft recommends and even Microsoft practices. But this is a cloud joined device that you're using as a privileged access workstation.
Yes.
And so that device is completely locked down with Intune. I'm assuming you don't allow browsers on that laptop.
The policy allows only Edge. It's got
no browsers, right? You can't install extensions.
Can't install anything extra. There's a bunch of proxy configuration that only allows Microsoft URLs in the browser. So if you try to go anywhere other than, say, the Azure admin portal or the Entra admin portal, try to go to google.com or anything else, blocked straight away.
And the autopilot, it installs the GSA client. It's all deployed.
Yep. So
how do you prevent someone doing a new build? Is that locked down by network, that the POR can only come from a known network location?
So with the POR, there's a couple of options, right? So either with autopilot, you can, and you're stretching my Intune knowledge here. I'm not an Intune guy, but with autopilot, you can either have the device shipped with an identifier that you map into the autopilot, or like in this case, because we were just doing such a small number, there's a method that you can use to generate the ID manually, but you have to have administrative control on the Intune side to match it up. So once you get that lined up, you just turn the device on and it builds.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, and if you turn on another device, you can't get it in. Yeah. Um, the other thing that I could probably say about the on-prem domain as well, just in terms of, we've obviously got domain administrators for Bastion, and we've got domain administrators for production, and we've got different administration VMs in that environment that can admin
Yeah.
either environment.
Right.
So just using authentication policy silos on-prem to decide which accounts can log on to which servers. So that keeps that separation as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Nice. Nice. That's a clean sort of separation then
Yeah. Yeah.
between and isolating the identities and what they can auth into. Cool. Awesome. Nice. Was there anything else you had?
Uh, yeah, not off the top of my head. As I said, we use Defender to watch everything, keep an eye on all of the logs. We set up the Bastion Forest AD so that it sends all of the appropriate logging through Defender for Identity. Yeah, we alert on account use, so we know if anything suspect's happening. But yeah, I don't think there was anything else that I can tell you.
I mean, obviously, people would be interested in knowing how you set up the emergency account to access because it's very locked down, right? And
Right.
now you need the paw device, and if you don't have any of the paws for some reason, um, how would you be able to get back into the tenant, right? Because it would be locked down as well. I mean, we don't need to go into the details, but it's it's part of what you secure, right? You have the ability to
Yeah.
get back in.
So the built-in or the first admin account in the tenant, I would set that up with a FIDO key and just exclude it from all of the CA policies that require a POR. And again, that FIDO key goes off into a vault somewhere. And yeah, for the on-prem built-in RID 500 admin account that we just generate the long password for, that account's only really needed if you have to get onto a domain controller in the Bastion Forest. And the thinking there was we're going to generate, I think we did something like a 32 character random password or maybe a 64, I can't remember, like quite long. And then the thinking was you would access those DCs directly from the corporate network because you have network connectivity. So at that point, you would log in
Into the
through that path.
right.
It's yeah, unfortunately, there's no way to apply a FIDO credential to the RID 500 account, and there's no way to hybrid join DCs, so you can't force a FIDO credential on the DCs anyway. Maybe Microsoft can figure that out, but
Look forward to that.
yeah, yeah. But yeah, I think holistically this is pretty robust. Aside from that RID 500 account, there's no passwords used anywhere. So I think when we did it, one of the critiques was we don't have a password vault, and I said, yeah, that's because there's no passwords.
Nice. Nice. So I mean, that's a really cool idea, and the implementation is even cooler,
Yeah,
where you sort of completely lock it down. And you went to the extent of doing all of that, right? And locking down the
yeah,
tenant.
yeah.
How do you prevent someone making changes to that tenant? Like when they have logged in as an admin and then sort of undo all of the things you did to secure that tenant.
Yeah, it's probably a job for Meister or something along those lines. Um, we didn't do it in the first iteration. I think Meister might not have been around, or it was like really new. And yeah, but yeah, we should definitely have a look at some kind of um, desired state change control stuff.
Yeah,
Um,
to keep monitoring it, right? Because over
yeah,
time, someone might be doing something and they're like, oh, I can't do this. Let me just disable this CA policy for 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And then they forget to turn it back on.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I won't talk about things I've heard about. There's that whole NDA thing, but yeah, yeah, I'm hopeful about things coming down the pipe that might be useful there too. Yeah,
I think one of the things you also might, whoever manages the tenant might need to do is the whole evergreen process, right? Because Microsoft adds new things and Microsoft might add a new auth method. By default, it's turned off, but it could be coming in as a Microsoft managed policy and then be
right.
turned on, after a few years. But you would need to really keep reviewing and making sure whether it applies to that tenant or not.
Yeah, this comes back to my secure by default feedback, right? Yeah.
I mean, it's the 90% of customers are collaborating, so you want it to be the most secure is like you turn it on and no one can access it, right? And
Right.
you need to go to turn on all the features to get the basic functionality working, which would make it really hard for a lot of people to use it. But there should be the sensible defaults that maybe it made sense 10, 15 years ago when something was introduced, and then they need to be updated.
Well, I mean, just thinking out loud, it might be a job for AI, right? So the tenant could start secure, and then it could go, what's your use case?
Exactly.
And you go, this is what I want to do, and then the AI runs off and sets it up.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that could be cool.
Nice. Yeah, I can't tell much, but yeah, it's a cool idea. Definitely. Yeah. Whatever the problem today, the solution is some AI involved in the loop, right?
Right. It's coming.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Nice. Thank you so much, Mark. It's been a lot of fun learning about what you did and how you rolled it out and made the whole thing. Like you took it from an idea all the way to figuring out, all the nooks of the
Yeah, it was good fun, man. It was really good fun. Yeah.
Nice. Awesome.
Okay.
Perfect. Thanks so much. So we will catch up next time. Thank you for coming on, Mark. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, anytime. Thanks, Merill. It's great.